Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session about ethics and transparency in psychedelic research. My name is Luis Fernando Toffoli. I'm going to be the host for this panel. If you have questions, I'll ask you to use, first of all, if you're in Hoover, it's best if you migrate to Zoom. There is a link in Hoover where you can migrate to Zoom because questions are going to be sent using Zoom, preferably using the Q&A option. But if you use the chat, make sure that if you wanna, to check the option if you wanna send a message to everyone or only for the panelists. But please, if you wanna ask questions, please use the Q&A panel for that, okay? So here we're gonna start with Michiel van Elk's presentation about replication and open science in psychedelic research. Michiel studied philosophy, biological psychology, and psychology of religion, and completed his PhD in cognitive neuroscience at the Donders Institute in Nijmegen. And he's working as an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. As the head of the Religion, Cognition, and Behavior Lab at the Department of Psychology, his research focuses on religion and spiritual experiences, and his research uses a multidisciplinary approach, including theories, insights, and methods from cognitive neuroscience, social psychology, anthropology, and religious studies. Welcome, Michiel.
Thank you, Louis, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Michiel van Elk, and I recently actually transitioned to Leiden University and Free University of Amsterdam. And today I'll be presenting on replication and open science and psychedelic research. And I'm really thrilled and honored to be able to talk about this topic because I really care about this and I really care about psychedelic research as well. And I think it's really a topic that's not something like, okay, this is something we should put on the agenda because any conference these days talks about open science, but it's really a crucial stage we're in, and this is really should be at the heart of the discussion of psychedelic research. Like, how do we go about doing research? So actually, I realized while preparing this talk that a lot of the information that I'll be presenting is quite factual. So a lot of recommendation and potential toolkits that you could use. So the slides are actually available on the Open Science Framework. Here's the link. I'll also post a link in the chat, and at the end of the slides you can find the link as well. So you can look up some of the things that I mentioned. So the information is available online afterwards as well. So an overview of what I would like to present today is I'll start with the cautionary notes, and then I'll discuss a couple of recommendations that we can actually focus on to warrant a safe scientific study of psychedelics, including open science badges, registered reports, meta-analysis, replication studies, and Bayesian statistics. And I realize it's a lot of information, so please bear with me. But first, the cautionary note. So we're all here because we are enthusiastic about psychedelic research. And we all talk about the psychedelic revival and the surge of interest in psychedelics, neuroscience studies, self-report studies, clinical studies, studies on the history of psychedelics. If you witness this conference, there's a wide variety of different researchers contributing to this field. So there's a psychedelic revival, but at the same time, there are some concerns with the current findings that are published in the literature related to small sample sizes. Many studies are actually underpowered. There's a selection bias. So many studies recruit volunteers who actually are interested in doing psychedelics or who had experience with psychedelics before. There's a breaking blind problem. People easily figure out in what condition they're assigned to, even at low doses with microdosing. And this in turn triggers demand effects. So people actually responding in a socially desirable way in line with the expectations triggered by the experimenter. At the same time, there's also researcher bias. Almost any person I encountered in the field of psychedelic research is a psychedelic enthusiast, him or herself, and has experimented with psychedelics. And we know from other fields that unconsciously and implicitly, this may introduce bias in the analysis of your results. Then there's also a concern of publication bias. Only positive findings are published and negative findings end up in a file drawer or null findings. And degrees of freedom, because it's so expensive and time expensive to run psychedelic studies, people include a wide variety of different measures. And this introduces a high degrees of freedom in terms of the potential ways in which you can look at the data. Well, just to give two examples of a concrete example of these concerns, like this is the very popular illustration of the entropic brain theory that you encounter in almost any popular science discussion on psychedelics. But if you closely look up the reference of that figure, it's actually based on a mathematical derivation of brain data really far removed from the actual data from a study that only included 15 participants. So actually quite a small sample study. And also the other famous network or famous explanation for psychedelics, so the default mode network in association with ego dissolution, has been replicated several times. But for instance, if you look at the correlations that have been reported in the literature in relation to like the subjective effects of ego dissolution and the brain level effects, the correlations are actually quite strong. But even if you do, with the sample size that was used, a post-hoc power analysis, it turns out that the power is only 0.35. So that means that if you run the study 100 times, that you will find this effect only in 35% of all studies. So this actually raises concerns about replicability. And this is important to care about because we want to avoid the mistakes that were made in the past. So the war on drugs that was triggered in the 1960s, when also psychedelic enthusiasts were advocating the use of psychedelics based on scientific studies that were not solidly founded. But even more importantly, the more recent replication crisis that we're only recently recovering from in psychology and in neuroscience. So the psychology has been hit hard by the replication crisis, as it turned out that only 36% of studies replicated. And we want to avoid this happening to psychedelic studies as well. We want to do solid research on psychedelics. So it's important to be cautious when looking at the research that has been published on psychedelics. So Rotem Petranker, who's actually also joining our for the Q&A, has written a very good paper on this topic. So I really recommend you all to read it, raising these concerns more elaborately, and you'll have time to chat with him as well after the presentation. So thanks, Rotem, also for joining this session. I'm looking forward to exchanging ideas with you a bit further. So this is just to raise caution. Now, a couple of recommendations. How can we improve on psychedelic science? Well, recent developments in psychology have, for instance, introduced open science badges. So if you publish a paper, you can apply for a badge on pre-registration, open data, and open materials. And you can see that in psychology journals, the use of open science badges has increased over the past years. And one main advantage of pre-registration is that you specify your hypothesis, sampling, and analysis plan in advance, prior to running the study and prior to running your data analysis. And a key advantage is that this allows you to distinguish confirmatory from exploratory analysis. So this way you can do your confirmatory analysis and still explore the data, but then at least you can clearly say, this is what we hypothesized. We also found these interesting effects, but those need to be replicated in a confirmatory study subsequently. You can also apply for open science badges for open data and open materials. And advantages of these is so you can share your data online, or you can put your materials online on the open science framework, is that it fosters increased transparency. It allows independent data analysis. So these days people are talking about multiverse analysis, creative destruction approaches to data analysis, where you basically offer other researchers the opportunity to repeat your analysis with their own processing pipeline to see if they can replicate what you did. It also allows secondary data analysis and inclusion in meta-analysis. Of course, we need to think carefully about privacy concerns, especially in relation to neuroimaging data, but there are a couple of toolboxes that can be used for sharing data on open repositories. So I definitely recommend you to consider applying for badges. Another development that is giving a new impetus to the way we do research is the use of registered reports, in which you basically submit your paper to a journal prior to running the study. So you design the study, you write your introduction and your method section, it's sent out for review, and only if the reviewers agree that this is a good idea and you have improved on the study design based on their suggestions, you go about collecting your data, analyzing your data, and then you write a report. And then it's again sent out for peer review before it's published. So advantages of registered reports are enormous. So you can benefit from peer review before you do the study instead of afterwards. And then you get an in-principle acceptance, meaning that irrespective of whether the hypotheses are confirmed, the study will be published. It still allows you to do confirmatory and exploratory analysis, so you still have freedom to explore in your data. And it reduces your own bias, experimental bias, and also publication bias, because also null results will eventually be published if you apply for a registered report. But still many people are hesitant for doing it because it's perceived to be time consuming. It takes actually a lot of time to draft a registered report, or it's perceived to take a lot of time. But in my experience, it's only a shift of the workload. So instead of doing the study and then trying to publish it at different journals, you put all this time at the beginning of the project, but then in the end, it definitely pays off in terms of getting your work eventually published. So it's a shift of the workload from the late phase to the early phase of the process, but it definitely pays off for your research. So when looking at psychedelics and these new developments, on the Open Science Framework, I could only find a very limited number of studies related to psychedelics, and most of those were related to microdosing, self-report studies, and or to the sharing of data sets in association with the publication of papers. As far as I'm aware, I could find no registered reports at all in psychedelic research. And if you're interested in applying for a registered report, here is a link to journals participating and supporting this type of format. But there's only one pharmacology journal listed so far, though a couple of neuroscience journals are participating in this initiative as well. So try it for yourself and try it out to see if it can benefit your research. Now, some of you might think, well, you're quite critical, you're discarding all these interesting results, but we have meta-analysis, right, to deal with these problems. We have meta-analytic tools to aggregate effect sizes across many different studies. And specifically in clinical research, meta-analysis and systematic reviews are the gold standard to evaluate the evidence for or against a specific intervention. And indeed, in the field, we see a couple of recent meta-analyses that have assessed the efficacy of psychedelic therapy. So based on that, you could say, so this is also a potential remedy for the problems that we encounter in the field. But if you put all the studies together, then you might still get an accurate overview of the effect. However, in those meta-analyses, there are only very few studies conducted with relatively small sample sizes. So it is actually difficult to control for instance, publication bias, because there are only so few studies. And not only that, because with meta-analysis, you can somewhat control for publication bias, but you cannot control for researcher bias, like the implicit motivation that people put in running their study and the selective reporting of results, because this is something that is invisible to meta-analysis. Also, we pointed out in the paper that it's quite easy actually in meta-analysis to make statistical flaws or errors, and that you actually need to get a statistician on board to do this properly. And most concerning is that actually different meta-analytic techniques can yield different evidence. So in this paper, we did a meta-analysis of religious priming data, a completely different field of social psychology. And we basically showed that with different meta-analytic methods, you could actually get very strong evidence for an effect or complete evidence of an effect, depending on which meta-analytic measure you chose. So our conclusion from this paper is meta-analysis are important. They can provide some preliminary insight, but they can never provide a conclusive evidence for the existence of an effect, because for that you need to run a replication study. So this brings me to the topic of replication. And replication is basically before you embark on a project and you try to do something completely new and out of the box, you first try to replicate what has been done before. So replicate first before you try to embark on new projects and extend on new projects. So over the past years, we have done, for instance, the Religious Replication Project, in which we set out to investigate a couple of key studies in the psychology of religion and spirituality, for instance, on the relation between religion and mental health, on the dualistic beliefs, etc. And we did this in a large cross-cultural context. So you can actually find information and preliminary results from this project on the website. And this actually allowed us to assess, like, what is the evidence for findings that have been published in the literature. Well, there's often a distinction made between direct and conceptual replication. So you can directly replicate a study using the exact same study design, or you can do a conceptual replication. So for instance, the entropic brain theory, you could try to do a direct replication by using psilocybin, or you could do a conceptual replication by using a different psychoactive substance, for instance, ayahuasca or LSD. Concerns with direct replication studies are like, which study do you select? Which study is most important in the field? Do you actually use exactly the same as in the original study, or do you update the design of the study based on new insights, for instance, in terms of neuroimaging settings and techniques? Especially small effect sizes that have been reported in the literature require quite a high number of participants. So that is actually a concern in terms of feasibility. And also you might ask yourself about the stability of findings in a cross-cultural setting. Can you replicate them cross-culturally? And can you replicate them in different times and cultures, or for instance, in a different scanner setting? And the involvement of the original authors. Do you want them to be involved in replicating the study as well? There's a cat meowing in my hallway, just close the door. So what to replicate? I learned over the past years that it's quite important to replicate your own findings before you publish them. So before going with the first study that you conducted and then submitting them, first try to replicate it if possible. Also try to select studies with a strong theoretical impact and lots of subsequent work. So I think, for instance, of the examples of the entropic brain theory or the default mode network. This has had a huge impact on the field. So we need actually different labs replicating those studies to see if actually the findings converge. And also go for studies with relatively large effect sizes, because the chances of replicating those studies are higher. A couple of recommendations: try to replicate and try to think of extensions. So you can add innovation to your replication by including one additional manipulation or additional measures. Try to get other labs involved to share the costs and the efforts instead of competition. So you can actually run a psychedelic study at multiple sites with multiple people if you're interested in brain scanning, for instance, because that's quite time and money intensive. Stay in good terms with the authors of the original study. So try to follow their protocol as closely as possible, and even try to get them involved as co-authors on a registered report, for instance. Eventually, you could even include an arbiter. So if it's a theoretically disputed effect, you could assign a third person or a third PI to act as an arbiter who decides, like, okay, this is the data, these are the theories, now I'm going to decide which theory is best supported by the data. And you can also use blinded analysis, so you can keep people blind to the assignment of conditions to avoid, again, experimental bias in the analysis of your results of your replication study. My final recommendation is, next to frequentist statistics, consider using Bayesian statistics. Because there are many advantages for Bayesian stats compared to frequentist stats. And these days it's become quite easy and feasible to do this. So you can download JASP for free, which is a software package that actually allows you to do both frequentist and Bayesian statistics. And a key advantage of Bayesian statistics is that you can quantify the evidence of your, in favor of your null model or the alternative model, rather than only rejecting one over the other. So you can actually say, we actually have quite strong evidence for the null hypothesis that there's no effect of this condition on that, which is also interesting because in frequentist statistics, you don't know, it might be the experimental design, but here you can really quantify the evidence for different models. It also allows the so-called sequential base factor analysis. So you can monitor the evidence for different models while the data are coming in. And you can specify, for instance, we want to test a maximum number of 80 participants, but we're going to monitor the evidence every 5 participants. And then if we have sufficient evidence for one model compared to the other, you're actually going to say, okay, this is where we stop data analysis. And this is completely warranted if you look into this design. And you can actually inform your priors. So this is often a discussion when it comes to Bayesian statistics. Well, how do you specify your priors? But you can use informed priors, for instance, based on meta-analytic results. So you can use meta-analysis to get a best guess on what the prior looks like in terms of the effect size. And then you can use this as input to your model. So this is just an overview of what JASP looks like. So it's quite easy and almost plug and play. It's quite similar to SPSS. So please try it for yourself and see if it can be of use for your research. So this is the end of my presentation. We went over a lot. So I started out with a cautionary note, then discussed open science badges, registered reports, meta-analysis, replication studies, and Bayesian statistics. So to conclude, my take-home message, it's exciting times for doing psychedelic research, but let's please safeguard ourselves from our own bias and from publication bias. And we have actually excellent tools to do so in these times of open science and replication. Implementing changes takes time, of course, but I really encourage you all to really seriously consider these recommendations and try to collaborate instead of compete, because these implementations all require collaborations with statisticians, between labs, etc. So in my view, science is a team effort, so please join the bandwagon and also try to implement open science and collaborate with others. And there are actually good examples, as for instance in the Many Babies project, in which they try to replicate developmental studies, which are also challenging and time consuming, and the Human Connected Genome project, which is a large-scale neuroimaging project. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and thanks also to the ICPR for hosting this session and paying attention to this topic.
Thank you very much, Michiel, for your fascinating presentation. We're going to join the session for Q&As at the end. We also have the presence of Rotem Petranker, who was mentioned by Michiel, who join us for the Q&A session. So we're going to move to Luis Felipe Valencio presentations. Luis Felipe has a bachelor's degree in biological sciences, a master's degree in psychology and health, and he's currently conducting research with psychedelics as a PhD student in public health at the University of Campinas as a member of the ICARO, the Interdisciplinary Cooperation for Ayahuasca Research and Outreach. His main subjects of the study are therapeutic uses of psychedelics, ritualistic use of ayahuasca, drug policy, harm reduction, bioethics, research ethics, informed consent, and deontology. Please, Luis Felipe, join us for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Toffoli. I would like to thank Open for the opportunity to speak in this panel. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so now I guess you can see it. So hello everybody, I'm Luis Felipe Valencio. I'm from Brazil. I've been working with these last years with studies related to bioethics, drug policies, and psychedelic use. I'm a biologist doing my PhD at State University of Campinas, as Toffoli said, in the state of São Paulo, Brazil. For my PhD research, I'm trying to comprehend from an interdisciplinary perspective how some ayahuasca groups, religious or not, because I'm also working with some research groups, deal with their ethical and safety issues or aspects. But today I want to do a broader reflection, focusing on the research ethics role and bioethics on the psychedelic field. I will develop this presentation from a Latin American epistemology on the bioethics field, and I'll try to point out some important challenges that are present in the field of psychedelic science. So bioethics as a field of study was initially developed with the aim of acting as a bridge between life sciences and humanities, since the first would be capable of producing technological advances faster than our ability to critically reflect on the impacts of these new technologies on human life and in the planet as a whole. The field of research ethics, now considered a sub-area of bioethics, was driven by the urgent need to interrupt scientific studies that were radical violation of human dignity. I also bring attention that controversial research involving psychedelics has been carried out, some even by official agencies like Army, and the use of psychedelic substances have also been used in an attempt to repair or convert homosexuals in the past, especially when homosexuality was still considered a deviation from heteronormative orientation. As for the global north, especially the USA, the notion of research ethics developed mainly from a principled ethics based on 4 principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. In addition to these principles, a strong focus on informed consent is also characteristic of this approach. As in many other areas of scientific field, these references were imported in an hegemonic way as ethical packages from many regions of the world, including Latin America. However, after a few decades of applying this approach to the global south, Latin American bioethicists began to point out some specific needs for which the uniquely principled approach was not able to meet the persistent problems of these populations, such as extreme poverty and social exclusion. Although extremely useful in clinical context, this approach wasn't enough to meet demands from the collective sphere in these countries. An example of these demands can be seen in the Brazilian research ethics regulatory system, which, unlike other countries, does not authorize to pay participants to participate in research. It is allowed only a small refund for food or transportation to the research site, since giving money to participants in context of extreme inequality could attract this most vulnerable population and subject them, only them, to the risks of scientific research, and only the possible benefits of this research would be distributed to the entire population. For the last few years, I have researched the Brazilian ethics control system and served as a member of research ethics committees in the country. From this perspective, we have elaborated in our laboratory some reflections on the particularities that psychedelic substances inaugurate for this regulatory system in the context of the expansions of studies carried out with psychedelic substances known as psychedelic renaissance. We recently published a chapter on the subject in a book edited by Associação Psicodélica do Brasil, so Psychedelic Association of Brazil, an organization strongly committed to equity and access to treatment with psychedelic substances in Brazil. Our goal with this chapter was to provoke a discussion on research ethics with psychedelic substances and to invite users, researchers, and members of research ethics committees to promote debates on the topic, especially considering the context in which these researchers occur in the country, extremely marked by the ills of prohibitionist policy and the war on drugs. Regarding the deontological aspects of research involving psychedelics, we draw attention to the following aspects: recruitment and preparation of research participants. Users of psychedelic substances report having a quite significant and transformative experiences with these substances, some of which may also involve discomfort and suffering, which may vary in intensity and duration. It is important that people participating in this research with psychedelics be prepared for the experience, in addition to being properly informed in the process of free and informed consent. Another relevant aspect related to the use of psychedelics is that, like other types of psychoactive substances, psychedelics also have contraindications, and it is advisable special care with people with a personal or family history of psychotic disorders or other serious mental disorders. In this sense, it is important that researchers pay attention to a careful description of the criteria for inclusion and exclusion from the research, acting with caution and precaution at the time of screening. A controlled setting and supervision during the session. The context in which a psychedelic substance is taken has a great impact on the production of the experience. Thus, researchers strive to conduct these experiments in controlled and comfortable places so that this context enhances the expected benefits and minimizes the anticipated risks. Regarding the ethical evaluation of studies involving psychedelics, it is important that the research ethics committee members evaluating the studies pay attention to the setting where the research will be carried out, considering the description of the proposed context presented by the researcher. Likewise, it is up to the researcher to clearly present the context in which the study will be conducted to the participant at the moment of inviting them to participate in the study and carrying out the free and informed consent process. Some of the clinical studies with psychedelics bring descriptions and details to take care during session. For example, strategies to ensure safety when participants need to go to the bathroom, to the toilet. The mystical experiences. One of the possible types of experiences contemplated with psychedelics are mystical experiences, where users report experiences of a spiritual nature of varying quality, such as the feeling of ineffability, the transcendence of time and space, the feeling of sacredness, among others. This is a type of phenomenon that is uncommon to the biomedical field and deserves a close look so that these experiences are properly welcomed, avoiding pathologization or other possible mistreatment, constraints, and iatrogenic practices to the research participants. Professionals interested in conducting research with psychedelic substances need to be aware to the proper management of these mystical states. We make a special addendum to the Brazilian context, where mystical practices of incorporating spirits are quite common and spread across different religious strands, such as Umbanda, an African Brazilian religion, or even some of the groups that uses ayahuasca, such as the case of Barquinha. The post-session and integration. An important safety factor for carrying out these studies is the follow-up of the participants after sessions with the use of psychedelics. Consideration should be given to ways to drive research participants to their homes, making sure they are accompanied by someone close to them, as difficult experiences with psychedelics can produce unexpected or even dangerous behavior after they leave the research site. In addition, during the entire period of participation in the study, as well as after its completion, the research team must guarantee participants forms of psychological assistance if necessary, in order to ensure a safe and adequate integration of the experience. The balancing of risks and benefits. One of the most important stages of ethical evaluation in research is to understand how to weight risks and benefits. The evaluator seeks to understand whether the expected benefits to the participants can outweigh the anticipated risks, thus justifying the participation of a particular person or collective in the research. When analyzing the risks and benefits of assisted therapy with MDMA and other psychedelic substances, Dr. Ben Sessa argues that this analysis should be carried out considering each case and several factors such as the balance between relative risks and relative benefits, the intervention used, and the time when it will be performed. Although all these deontological aspects are essential to ensure safety for the participants, we believe that this approach only is not enough to contemplate all the ethical aspects relevant to conducting research with psychedelics, especially considering the particularities of the research carried out in Global South. We believe that the ethical epistemologies produced in Latin America can contribute to expand this notion of ethics, values that are strongly expressed in the 2005 UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, with emphasis on the articles on human dignity and human rights, respect for human vulnerability and individual integrity, equality, justice, and equity, respect for cultural diversity and pluralism, solidarity and cooperation, social responsibility and health, sharing of benefits, and protection of environment, biosphere, and biodiversity. The collaboration between Global South and Global North has been shown to be important in advancing the scientific study on the therapeutic potential of psychedelic substances. Also, the collaboration between researchers and communities that make traditional use of psychedelics has also proved to be fertile, as the case of regulating the ayahuasca in Brazil, made possible through the contribution of these agents and researchers, both in the field of human sciences and biomedical sciences. In this way, we understand that all agents can join efforts in an expanded notion of ethics, and it can become a paradigmatic change in the way we understand care, health, and the relationships between human beings and other beings on the planet. Otherwise, we will be promoting the maintenance of paradigms that were systematically used to perpetuate inequities and ecocide. To expand horizons and to question paradigms is not an easy task. Although there are no checklists or maybe only a few principles capable of leading us through this task, we believe that the engagement of researchers from different areas of knowledge can be transformative to designing a broader agenda which takes in account the local social particularities of the different members of communities that uses psychedelics around the world. Important initiatives are already being taken. For example, by the Chacruna Institute that dedicates efforts to foster debates about race, gender, and class in communities that use psychedelics. Listening to these voices and including them in our research efforts can help us to shape a better, collective, good trip for everyone in the psychedelic field. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Open, for the opportunity of talking in this panel. And I'm here available for exchanges, questions, and feedbacks.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. Now I'm going to invite Rotem Petranker to give us, could you please unshare your screen, Luis? Thank you. Rotem is a clinical psychologist student with John Eastwood's lab at the York University. He's been researching interests as sustained attention, emotional regulation, and creativity, all of which are ostensibly affected by psychedelics. Rotem is passionate about establishing a rigorous framework for the study of psychedelics using the principles of open science. His clinical interests include disorders amenable to psychedelic psychotherapy, including mood disorders and OCD. So we'd like to hear a little bit from you, Rotem. Please join us.
Sure. Thanks very much. And thanks for the excellent two talks here. I think they were both really, like, the content is great and really useful stuff. I'm excited for the discussion. So I don't want to take up too much time from the discussion. I just want to add, I have one thing to add to Michael's talk, just in terms, I wanted to speak very briefly about pre-registration and how, so the idea is that you kind of plan your study ahead of time and you lock everything in. And then you, as Michael said, you front load the process. I want to say that while there is a learning curve and it takes a little bit to really learn how to do it, it is by far, it makes the whole workflow more efficient and you have to do less ultimately. So I think it's worth it. The earlier you adopt it, the more benefits you're going to reap from it. And just to give you a couple of examples as to what I mean about that, you know how it is when you had some intuitions and you ran a study and you collected a bunch of data, and then at the end of the study, you're looking there and you're looking at the data set and you say, well, what do I do now? Now I have to actually start planning all of my analyses, and I got to start fishing because I got to get all the significant results out. So you don't have to do that. If you pre-register, you just have a list of all the analyses you're going to do. And then when you have the data, you just go one by one, do all the analyses, and that's it. You don't have to think about it anymore. And another, perhaps in my experience, this has been very, very useful. You then write your manuscript and you submit it for review. And then sometimes the reviewer is going to say, hey, how about if you run this analysis or that analysis? Or I think you should run your analysis in a different way. And you can just say, nope, I pre-registered everything. It's locked in. I can't deviate. And so I think it also creates less work like that, because if reviewers ever push back against your analysis, you say, it's set in stone. There's nothing I can do about it. Yeah, so I think that's all I have to say, and I'm really excited to hear what our audience has to say too.
Thank you, Rotem. I have here some questions. I have two questions for Michiel. One of them from someone named Mackenzie. Do you think that replication issues have anything to do with the lack of diversity among participants, meaning the lack of inclusion of underrepresented people, from race to disability? Historically, psychedelic research participation, both in the research team and participants, are fairly homogeneous, of able-bodied persons who are generally highly educated and happen to be white. The person is interested to hear how this plays into the conversation about how this intersects with bioethics. So Luis can say a little bit later if he wants about this as well. So this is the first question to Michiel. I'm gonna add the second one so you can answer the way you prefer and the order you prefer. The second one is, could you please specify why you would choose studies with large effect size for replication?
Yeah, excellent questions. Regarding the first question, please don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that we have replication issues in psychedelic research. We don't know yet, because hardly anyone is trying to replicate. And I'm just making the point, like, look, there are all those interesting findings out there. but the sample sizes are relatively small. So please, before we make any further strong claims, let's see if we can first replicate some of the basic stuff before we move on. That being said, I think diversity is definitely an issue that should be taken into account in replication studies. In social psychology and in cross-cultural psychology, you had the whole discussion on weird participant, like people from Western, highly educated, industrialized, rich, developed countries. That most of the psychology findings were actually based on those participants. And now you have a movement to more diversity in psychology to include to conduct studies in different settings, different countries, and by using people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, for instance. And I think a similar concern is valid in psychedelic research. Like those studies are typically conducted in large cities, indeed, among highly educated people. Also, if I look at the microdosing studies that we did, those are also relatively wide, highly educated people with a strong motivation for self-development, spiritual development, etc. So there's a strong selection bias there as well that needs to be taken into account. But let's first we should just do the basic replication and then extend and address the issue of diversity, I think. So those are two separate concerns. Then the question about the sample size, or not the effect size. So what I mentioned is how you can think about which study is actually most important to replicate, and then one indicator that you could consider is effect size. Because if you go for a very small effect, for instance, tiny effect size, a very small correlation between this trait and that trait, like a propensity for openness to experience and this part of the psychedelic experience, for instance, then that is possible to replicate. But if you do your power analysis, you will find out that you need a large sample to actually show this effect. But if you already aim for a huge effect in the first place, this makes life easier and it will increase your chances that you will actually be able to replicate the effect. And also it's more feasible. So for instance, I think if you would go for replicating the main effects of psilocybin on the brain level, like this is such a right in your face manipulation that of course you're going to find some difference at the brain level. But if you're going for the correlational findings between the self-report measures and the brain activity, this is much more variable at the individual level. So that might be more tricky. So yeah, be careful in considering like which effects you aim to replicate. That was my suggestion. And then large effect sizes have a higher chance of replicating than smaller ones.
I just want to jump in. Sorry, I just want to add to that.
I'm a little bit concerned with the time. If you could be really brief, please.
Yeah, for sure. So I won't get into the theoretical reasons. I agree with everything Michael said, but just I want to add also that because sample sizes were quite small in many of the studies, as Michael said, when the sample size is small, when power is low, then whatever effect sizes are observed are often exaggerated. So it's important to replicate them to see what the actual effect size is.
Great. I have two questions for Luis. Luis, on the ethics of inducing mystical spiritual type experiences, especially in atheist, materialist, rationalist participants. So how problematic it is that participation in psychedelic research or therapy might result in changes in worldview towards a more spiritual / religious direction. And there's another question. There was an early question sent through Hoover by Marcus Storvik. This question was by I just said it was from Samuli Kangaslampi. And another question by Marcus Storvik, which is more or less similar. The person he's curious about to hear a comment if there are specific ethical problems that could arise from inducing increased suggestibility.
Okay, yeah. So answering the first question, it's a very good question. We have some discussion on this here in our laboratory, and mostly I think that if this topic is problematic, it's basically if it's not treated in the or said during the informed consent process. So participants must be informed of this possibility, as it's one of the possibilities of the experience with psychedelics. So I think this is mostly problematic if this doesn't come in the informed consent process. And also this also raises a question maybe on integration. I don't know, maybe seeing how these people will integrate this new experience in life and making sure they go okay through it. So Toffoli, I just forget the second question. If you could please repeat.
The second one is about suggestibility, about someone, which is kind of similar to the first one, was regarding mystical experiences, I suppose.
Okay, so I think this is a very great question too, and I think this also remains on the informed consent process, because people must be informed on all tasks and tests they are going to be asked to do during these experiments. So if they are properly informed about all these tasks, so we will maybe minimizing the risks of people doing like being asked to do a specific task that they were not aware. So I think this is something that we must pay attention in the informed consent process too.
Great. Thank you, Luis. That's about time we have to close. I want to thank Luis, Rotem, and Michiel. And I want to tell all participants that this talk can continue if you use the link that was posted in the chat. So there is a multi-room, meetup room set up for you to join the participants of this panel, the panelists, and talk to them and ask further questions. Unfortunately, I couldn't ask all the questions that was sent, so you could go there and talk to them. And I will also post it in Hoover. Okay, so I want to thank all the participants. I want to thank the panelists and open once more. And I'll close the session. Thank you very much for your attention and your presence.
Thank you all. See you around.
Thanks, everyone. Peace.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.